Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today, I'm here with Dr. Matthew Thomas. Once again, Dr. Thomas, I'm having you on to talk about one of the Apostolic Fathers. Last time we talked about St. Irenaeus, and this time we're talking about Clement of Rome. And so, Dr. Thomas, could I just have you start off by talking about, I remember you mentioned your book last time on Clement of Rome and the dating of First Clement. Could you talk about the progress that you've made on that book so far?
Oh man, you're starting me off with humiliation here, Swan. So there has been progress in that, the translation itself is refined to, to a point where I'm, happy with everything. I really smoothed out the translation for our patristic class this semester, and so that's in good shape. It's just a matter of having to finish up, all the front matter and things like that, which is a matter of having time available to do that. So I'm hoping this summer to be able to finish all those things off and finally send it off to St. Vladimir, because it has been a long time coming. There is also, the issue of when you have a topic that you really enjoy, you're not necessarily thinking like, oh, I just, get this out of here. I want to be done. You always find new angles, new things to think about. And so, that's definitely contributed to, the project taking longer than it would have otherwise, because Clement is just fantastic. The opportunity to be able to spend time with his writing is just something that I'm really grateful for. So anyway, hopefully, this summer we'll be able to send it off and get it to a theological bookstore near you, if those still exist anymore.
Well, Dr. Thomas, let's start off with just understanding who Clement of Rome was. And I'm especially interested in, this is a question that has been in scholarship for a while. But, in Philippians 4:3, Paul mentions, that he's sending some co-workers down to the church in Philippi. And then there's a question about, he mentions this Clement figure. And there's a question on, is that Clement in Philippians 4:3 Clement of Rome? And so I know those are like two questions, but what do you make of, who Clement of Rome was?
Yeah, so let's start with what you noted with the mention in Philippians 4 of Clement. It's interesting when we ask a question like this, the response is usually going to tell you as much about the respondent as it's going to about the data that you're looking at itself, because the data that we have is there. We have the testimony from fairly early that this is the same Clement that was mentioned, and so I believe that we have this attested by Origen, if I remember correctly, that this is who the figure is to be identified with, and it makes sense. There's no really obvious reason why one would say no, that's Origen's just making things up. He tends to not make things up for whatever his faults might be elsewhere, his limitations. As a historical resource, he takes history quite seriously, and so the identification is made fairly early, and there's nothing inherently implausible about it. Part of the challenge is that as a biblical scholar, there's a sense in which you're kind of paid to be a skeptic. That's kind of what we are as biblical scholars, is we're paid skeptics. You have heard it said, fill in the blank, but I, biblical scholar, say to you, and then whatever the way that it actually is, we'll go and tell you. So we tend to lean towards being, I guess you could say, we will doubt something until the evidence for it actually being the case is sort of overwhelming. And it's a posture that I think can have value. It also has limitations, and it could make it so that people get frustrated with biblical scholars, very easily. Because like, how is it that you guys are just agnostic on everything? Or why are you applying this radical suspicion to all these things that you wouldn't normally do? And, in normal life, if you apply this to everything, like you would never buy a dishwasher, because everybody would be lying to you, making things up, and you wouldn't be able to function as a human being. And I think those are all fair, fair criticisms. And so from my standpoint, I don't think, some people would be comfortable saying in an absolute sense, yes, this is absolutely the guy. And I don't think that you can necessarily say that, do I think it's probable that it's the same guy? I do think so, because you do have pretty early attestation, and I can't think of a clear reason to doubt it. There's nothing inherent in the claim that is unlikely. And so in my view, it is probable it's the same person that is Paul's co-worker in Philippians. But because the attribution, though it's fairly early, it's not necessarily contemporaneous. It's one of those things where I wouldn't stake your salvation just on that one point alone, because your biblical scholars are probably right that even if there's some likelihood to it, it can't be demonstrated with absolute certainty, as most historical claims can't be demonstrated with absolute certainty. So that's the connection between Philippians 4 and our Clement figure. If we're looking at who Clement actually is, it's a really interesting question, because we have so much data which seems to be largely bad data. We have this huge body of writings called the Clementine homilies and the Clementine recognitions. And this goes on for a long, huge, chapter after chapter after chapter, telling you about this guy Clement and his story and where he comes from and how it was that he became a Christian. And he runs into Barnabas, then he runs into Peter, and then they chase down around Simon Magus for a while. And it's sort of like a Ghostbusters thing, and Simon Magus is the ghost. And there's all kinds of wild, crazy stuff happening. Before too long, it gets a little theologically, you might say, unorthodox. There's some bits you get into, like, who did you really just say that? And so some people think, well, maybe there's some sort of some sort of Gnostic interpolations that you have. The material itself, though, goes into a lot about Clement's life, is most people think is fairly late. So 3rd century, perhaps 4th century, although maybe the roots of some of those things go back to the 2nd century. What do I actually know about Clement himself on his own? The answer is not a great deal. We have the things that are preserved from Eusebius, from Jerome, telling us that he's a convert to the faith, that he was the associate of St. Paul, who was mentioned in Philippians, and that he was the successor of St. Peter. The question historically that's really interesting is, how is it that he functions as the successor to St. Peter? Because if one has been around the canon of the Mass recently, you've probably heard something like Linus, Cletus, Clement, and then it kind of goes on from there, Cornelius, all those guys. And so you think, okay, so you got Peter, then you got Linus, then you got Cletus, then you got Clement. But what's really interesting is, if you look within the early fathers, you find this story repeated from sources that seem to be independent of one another, and which are all quite early, that say that Peter ordained with his own hands Clement to be his successor, which would seemingly mean that he did it when he was alive, not that zombie Peter comes back from the dead after Linus and Cletus, and then goes and lays his zombie hands on him to make him his successor. These are all living non-zombie Peter when the story is told. And so if that's the case, then the question is, when is this actually going and taking place, and how do Linus and Cletus factor in all this? One of the questions I think is really interesting, even though this isn't directly on Clement, is, we know these guys, Linus and Cletus, and if you were to ask somebody and say, like, hey, what do you know about Linus and Cletus? The answer would probably be absolutely nothing, because we know so little. There's so little within the early Christian tradition that says anything about these guys. We know them as names. We have a really late, Acts of Linus, which I think is in Latin, and which I don't think people really take as being historical. We've got basically nothing besides that they are names. And so Jerome tells us that, here's your traditional, succession, that it goes Peter, Linus, Cletus, Clement, and it goes on from there. But then he goes and tells you that most of the Latins say that's not the way that it actually worked, that it actually went straight from Peter to Clement. And if, a source is going to be familiar with this, it would probably be the Roman Church, the Latins. Like, they probably know their own succession list better than others. And so there's various theories as far as how all that worked. And one of them, which is, I kind of thought this was a way that made sense of the data, and then I later found that this is what Rufinus says, is that you have Linus and Cletus, who are in a sense sort of suffragans, in that they are those who are in charge of the church. They're in Rome when Peter is not there. And so if Peter is in Rome, say around 42, 44, and he's martyred somewhere around 64, something like that, that they, one after the other, were those who were in charge of the church while he was, not present, because we know from Acts that he's elsewhere. He shows up in Jerusalem and the council in 49. And so that would be an explanation that would then give you a sense of how it was that Peter could still, during his lifetime, without being zombie Peter, lay hands on Clement and ordain him as his direct successor, and still give you a place for Linus and Cletus. Also kind of explain why we don't know anything about them, because they were, they were suffragans of sorts. It would also then, I think, give you some correspondence when you're thinking of when is this written, because one of the big questions, and this is something that really got me into studying Clement at first, besides just that I really liked it, is trying to figure out when it's dated, because Eusebius tells you that it's written under Domitian in around 95 or 96 AD, but it seems like a strange document if that is when it's written. There's a number of things that don't seem to fit particularly easily, and there has historically been a significant minority report, or at least from our vantage point, what seems to be a minority report that dates it earlier, so 69, 70, before the destruction of the temple. And we can talk about this more at length, but my view is that this second view, that first Clement is actually written earlier, it is likelier to be the correct view. I think that it has more and stronger evidence for it, and that would accord with the idea that this was a real succession that took place, a real laying on of hands from Peter to Clement that happens, during Peter's earthly lifetime, and not during some sort of weird post-mortem thing. And that then would then give you the explanation for why in the early church, from these rather diverse sources, you have this story that is preserved of the ordination of Clement by Peter. So long answer to a short question. The SparkNotes version is, we don't really know a whole lot that's very solid, but I think that there is a good case to be made that he was, an associate of the apostles. This is, Irenaeus goes and tells you that he was, he had the preaching of the apostles still in his ringing in his ears, and Irenaeus is writing around like 180, and so it seems as though there's an association with both Peter and Paul. And because of that, I think as a witness to early Christianity and early Christian theology, it makes him, I think, especially valuable and especially rich.
And I've also heard people say that the Greek in First Clement is like very polished and well written, and this would indicate maybe that Clement was a well-educated man, possibly wealthy. Do you have any thoughts on the Greek of First Clement?
Yeah, so there have been some who have wanted to associate Clement with the royal household in Rome, and so this is something that a little over a century ago, J.B. Lightfoot spent a lot of time and energy going and making this connection between a certain Flavius Clemens, which is mentioned by Eusebius, who was part of the emperor's household, and we know of there being, if I remember correctly, I think that there is a certain figure who was deported or something like that. I don't think that they were actually martyred, and so there's the thought, is there some association with Christianity that's here, and is Clement somehow associated with the household? In general, I have a really high estimation of Lightfoot's work. I've never really seen that connection to be a conclusive one, and so I would be reticent to place too much weight on it. if we're looking at the text itself and the Greek is really good. It reads really well. It's just a joy to, I mean, I've been reading the Greek of this for, gosh, like 11 years now, something like that. It really is a joy to be able to go through and read. And so it is good quality. You're still not dealing with a, I guess you could say, an elevated literary style beyond, kind of like what you're going to see with, like Josephus or Philo or something like that. And so it's not difficult to read in being a good quality Greek. And it is variable as well, because there are little bits where it gets a little bit more poetic. And so I remember when I was first translating this a couple of years ago and doing the initial translation for it, I got to First Clement 20, and there's a sort of praise of God's work in all of creation. And you could just, it gets very lyrical, and as such, it gets really hard to translate. And so if one was a if one was a really committed source critic, you would probably go and stop there, at chapter 20 and say, the Deutero-Clementine author has snuck in here because it's, doing something rhetorically, which is at a different register than a lot of the rest of it. I don't think you necessarily need to do that. I just think you can have elevated rhetoric at certain moments when it's called for. And here, I think that Clement thinks it's called for. It's a beautiful little passage. The Greek itself is, we have from Clement of Alexandria, and then passed on. I think actually it might be first from Pantaenus, and then Clement of Alexandria and Origen. You have the book of Hebrews passed on by these early witnesses as being, when it comes to content, being Pauline. So it's from Paul. But the question is, who actually goes and writes it down? Who is your secondary hand? So who's the amanuensis who has a role in the literary shaping, whether or not there's some sort of, Hebrew original, something like that, or whatever it happens to be, what accounts for the difference in language that you have between, Hebrews and the rest of, what we recognize as the Pauline epistles. Clement is one of the two figures that have historically, been identified as candidates to be this amanuensis. So some say Luke, some say Clement, and then Origen goes and tells you only God knows. And that's the sort of famous thing where biblical scholars, because we do things like this, we take that line completely out of context and make it sound as though what Origen is saying is that only God knows, sort of in general. So not who the amanuensis is, but whether or not this is, from Paul or not Paul. And which is really funny, because he's literally told you in the last sentence that it is from Paul. And then he goes and the following sentence says, therefore, if any church says this is from Paul, let them be commended for this, which is really curious if this is the wrong answer. So the question is, who is the secondary hand? Clement is one of your top two candidates within the early church. And you can see a lot of reasons for that, because, both Hebrews and First Clement are in, really high quality Greek. And there's also, if you're thinking of documents from early Christianity that are pretty certainly represented within First Clement, Hebrews would be at the top of the list. Hebrews is, I would say Hebrews, First Peter probably to a lesser degree, but which I think is probably represented here. But Hebrews, you're going to find parallels all over the place with the thought of Hebrews, and so that's, historically there's been an identification of this, the amanuensis of Hebrews with Clement, and I think that there is, it's not an unreasonable identification, even if it's something that we can't necessarily, from our vantage point, say with confidence one way or the other.
Yeah, and just to kind of get to another question too, because you mentioned kind of your theory about Linus and Cletus.
Yeah.
So from what I gathered, your answer was that, and this is another question that I'd love to talk about as well, which is like the episcopacy in Rome, because that's also a hot topic right now. Like, when did we have an episcopacy in Rome, or what kind did we have? But let's table that really quick. So,
sure.
You would place the kind of leadership of Linus and Cletus in the 40s, and then eventually, like, Peter returns before his martyrdom, 64, 67 AD, right, and directly appoints Clement. And so is the idea that, like, Clement immediately succeeds to Peter after his martyrdom, Because if that's the case, then the like the traditional dates that we have for like when Clement was Bishop of Rome, which is like in the late 90s, that would have to basically change. But I mean, what's your take on all that?
Yeah, exactly. So this is, it's interesting. In some ways, I'm kind of a good person to be working on this, because I actually I don't find the early or I guess you could say I don't find the the dating of and the way that the episcopal succession works in the early church, particularly the Church of Rome. I don't find it to be a personally interesting question. And so because so in some ways, I think that it makes me kind of more useful as like a referee in questions like this, because the sense that I get is that sometimes you can have people who have um, you know, pretty serious dogs in the fight, and major axes to grind one way or the other. And it's just never something that's been animating for me. I've always been more interested in like, oh wow, it seems like he's reading from Hebrews here, or it seems like First Peter's here. Those kinds of things like that, or trying to just date the document specifically and trying to go through those particular clues. What you said, I think, the way that in having worked on this for a good while, the reconstruction that you gave is basically what I think is the likeliest as well. Now, it's interesting if you go through the early sources, so the Liber Pontificalis, if you go through the all the different kind of lists, you do have variation. There's not a just one succession list, and again, Jerome attests to this, that there's one that he's kind of going reporting, but the Latins are themselves saying no, it worked a different kind of way. And so from early on, the way that these first four work is a little bit murky. And so the scenario that I suggested for you, which is what Refinance goes and gives us as well, I think is a way of reconstructing the data where you can make sense of all of the individual elements, which I think would make sense. I think it's important to say that any reconstruction that we have of this early history, I think necessarily has to be a tentative one. And so if somebody has a dissenting view, I don't think that it means that one should throw food objects at them or something like that, because I think that there's more than one reasonable way of putting this together. But having really looked at this data for a long time, what you said, where Clement does receive this kind of succession from Peter directly before his death, I think it is what makes the most sense of the data, and it accounts for how what seems to be that piece of memory is preserved in quite independent sources in the second and third centuries. It doesn't seem like it's one thing that like it's some sort of game of telephone where one person said it and then another source heard it and then they repeated it, and another source heard it and then they repeated it. It seems to be preserved in independent witnesses, which I think requires some kind of historical explanation, because I don't think there's any a priori reason why Clement needs to have some kind of succession from Peter. It doesn't, it just I don't think that you need something like that from an apologetic standpoint. I think that really, if you're looking at why do we tend to date First Clements, around 95, 96, I think it's reliance on Eusebius, and reliance on Eusebius most days of the week, I think is a good thing, because Eusebius is a good historian and he does a good job. Eusebius, when it comes to Western sources, is famously conjectural. He just doesn't know Western sources that well. He doesn't know Latin sources that well. He just doesn't know those things. And so he has, the account of the martyrs of Lyon and those, the beginning of book 5, which is incredible, and stuff about Irenaeus. But in general, he doesn't have as much to tell you about things that are happening in the East. And it's because he's writing, or sorry, in the West. And that's because he's writing, from the East, which is writing from Caesarea. So just down the road on the coast outside of, of Jerusalem itself. And so when it comes to things that are happening in the West in Western dates, if there were to be a source in which he would be mistaken, it would, I think, be something like First Clement, because these are just the types of things that he in general is a little bit less accurate on.
And just to kind of branch into my next question, which was so concerning the episcopacy in Rome. I mean, this is such a hot topic, and there's like sparks flying everywhere on, a lot of people are saying, especially, I'm sure you're familiar with like Robert Eno, Eamon Duffy, Peter Lamp, a lot of these guys who have said like there was no kind of preeminent, there wasn't the Bishop of Rome. There might have been like a college of bishops or who knows what structure was there. Do you have any thoughts on just, for instance, some people will say like we can't trust Irenaeus when he talks about this succession from Peter, because he's just retrojecting the monoepiscopacy back into the first century, right? And then we have Hegesippus, I think 20 years earlier, with his list of succession from Peter, if I'm not mistaken. And so there's a lot that's going around, and so I'm interested in what you think about the structure of the Roman Church in the first century.
Yeah, it's funny how we all sort of turn to Dan Brown sometimes, depending on the way that we're looking at the data, the way that our own particular interests align, everything like that. And I think that's something that we're all liable to. A couple things I'll say. The first is that I think I have a Protestant background that I'm very grateful for, and have been a part of a lot of different Protestant churches and everything like that. So I can say that from looking at this data as a Protestant, and looking at your arguments, your counter arguments, and then all of the actual data that we have, all the evidence that we have from the early church, what was always striking to me is that when you had scholars arguing that the received history, the received tradition was unreliable, it was there, it's a conspiracy, it's the Illuminati, it's whatever, it's the Hamburglar got a time machine and went back, and he stole the records of how the church really worked in Rome, way back when. Whenever I would come across scholars who were, saying things along those lines, that, and arguing that the unreliability of the, the received early tradition there, what I would always look for is I would look for the evidence that they would have, the positive evidence, not just saying negative evidence why we think it's unreliable, but the positive evidence for what it is that they thought actually was the case. And again, having a Protestant background, that was something where I was really interested in that, whether it was, and again, with a lot of different kinds of processes in the background. So from, Presbyterian to your kind of like anti-authoritarian, low church charismatic, to sort of everything. Because I'm just interested. I want to know, like, what actually was there? If this is wrong, what's the thing that is right, and what's the evidence that goes and rests on? And things always got real quiet around that. Things got real quiet when it came to what's the positive evidence there is for something else being the case. You can give me the arguments for why this person is this lying, and this, this people aren't telling you the truth, and this person is fantasizing about this and another, and this Hamburglar or whatever does this. But like, what's the actual positive evidence for they were all Presbyterians, or they were all Baptists, or they were all, fill in the blank, whatever happens to be. And it would just get real quiet. And eventually I found that to be sort of instructive. that this is because there's not necessarily positive evidence for an alternative hypothesis here. Now, you can still make the case that what you've received from the tradition, what you've received from Irenaeus, what you received from all these other sources, is unreliable. It's false. It's the grand conspiracy. Dan Brown's right, and that there was something else that was there. But it's tough to make a historical argument for that something else being there. That is going to amount to more than projection of what we would like to have been there. This is, Robert Grant, great patristic scholar, Anglican guy. He has a really, he has this great comment that he made in his commentary on Clement that I first started using, about a decade ago, where he says, you can look in a couple centuries of, kind of post-Reformation commentaries on Clement, and you can basically identify them as worthless. And the reason these are worthless is because they're all caught up in what it is that they think Christianity should have been. And so they don't end up really giving you an exposition analysis of the data. It's just they're caught up in, no, Christianity should have been this thing over here, it should have been this thing over here, instead of saying, well, what do we actually have evidence for it being? I think if we look at the idea of monopiscopacy, I think, so if I remember correctly, we might have talked about this in the Irenaeus episode, but if we did, I'll just briefly say it here as well. I think that the evidence for monopiscopacy, if you want to say, hey, where does the origins of this, where does this come from? I don't look to Rome. I don't think that that's actually the place that you should look. And I don't think that, I think the evidence is in a sense a lot simpler. I think that you look to Jerusalem, and I think you look to James, because James, it seems from everything that we've got in the early church, if you're looking at, the book of Acts, looking at all the testimony we've got from the early church, it seems as though James is the unquestioned leader of the Jerusalem church. And that's something that it seems as though, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, everybody kind of agrees on that. And I don't know of anybody who really tries to go and make the claim that, James is part of some presbytery or something, and he's just sort of like the spokesperson. Everybody seems to think that James has real authority, and I think that they're right. And I think that, whether you're using that as kind of like a James versus Peter kind of thing, whatever you do with that, at least I think one can agree that it seems as though within the Jerusalem church, there's a real authority that James possesses, and it's a unique authority. It's not James within the context of all these other people, the other things that are going on. It's like, yeah, he's James. In my view, it's actually Jerusalem and James that sets the model for what you find with the rest of the churches elsewhere. And so I think that when you have Rome and you have the Roman succession, I don't think that you have the Roman church making this up. I think this is something that's been inherited from Jerusalem, from the example that we have, with the original mother church, with James, and the succession that goes and follows from James. I think that in a sense, Rome is a copy of Jerusalem here. That's just one of those things where I think if you look to Jerusalem, and there's a sense in which Rome ecumenically is always heated ground. Whenever you're talking about anything Roman, everybody they put their boxing gloves on, and they have to find somebody to punch, whether you're for or against, something like that. But Jerusalem, we tend to ecumenically, we tend to not be on our guard, or as defensive, and I think it's actually really helpful to recognize that what the church is saying about Rome is not anything different from what it is that the Bible itself says about Jerusalem and James and his early leadership there. That's the model that Christians follow.
Yeah, I found it really refreshing when you mentioned the Jerusalem church, because I was reading like B.H. Streeter's book, The Primitive Church, and he just says, I don't know what else to call this, but mono-episcopal, right? And then was it Adjus Fernando in his commentary on Acts? I think he just refers to James like the president or something like that. So I mean, there's still a sense
Yeah.
of preeminence of James from the rest. And so, then there's that question, well, before James was like Bishop of Jerusalem, let's say, we know that Peter really was the one running the show in Jerusalem, like in the first few chapters of Acts. And so it's like, I wonder, like, if Peter repeated what he had done in Jerusalem in Rome, right? I mean, that seems like at least not implausible. But
Yeah.
of course, those are just some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah. No, I think that is, if we're trying to reconstruct, what Peter may or may not have done, for me, the go-to source on this is Marcus Bockneel's book, Simon Peter in Scripture and Memory. Marcus is great in that he is so thorough as a historian, and is still the example that, whenever I look at any of his books, I just think, my own book is modeled on his work, and I still haven't gotten close to the kind of thoroughness that he has. And he's, what I love about Marcus is how fair he is in that, he's writing from a Protestant background, but somebody who's ecumenically sensitive as well, and isn't trying to go and score points necessarily for either side. And so when one is looking at early reconstructions like this, and the way that memory is preserved within what we're calling early tradition, but which is itself really memory of the things that happened and didn't happen. His book with Baker, Simon Peter in Scripture and Memory, is the best thing out there. It's incredible.
Yeah, and actually, I have a copy of it just like right sitting nearby.
Fantastic.
And like I remember at the end of the book, he just basically said, what was he said, yeah, I mean, it's just the remembered Peter's profile in the 2nd century is very clear that he had ecclesial shepherd successors in Rome, in Antioch, but above all in Rome, he says. And then I also have his book, The Remembered Peter, the Morris Seebeck book.
Wow.
Which cost me a pretty penny.
Suan, that is incredible. I don't know. I've never actually seen anybody besides myself holding that book before. And both because, Marcus goes and makes that material in that book so much more, accessible, and it's also so much cheaper in the Baker version. So the fact that you have the Morris Seebeck one really says something about you. I'm impressed. Even I had to get it from the library. I couldn't go and buy myself a copy. So that's incredible.
Yeah. I'm like the one guy who's sustaining like the Morris Seebeck, like all the additions and the proceeds. I'm sustaining that all by myself.
That's fantastic. Well, I mean, as somebody who has published with Morris Seebeck, I thank you.
Well, okay. So to the second official question on the docket, I enjoyed that aside that we had.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you've already talked about how you side with the early dating of Clement, and that seems to be a rising kind of consensus that I've noticed in the scholarship. Of course, it's not like firmly planted just yet, but it seems to be kind of becoming more vocal. So could you go into just why you go with the early dating of Clement?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first read Clement, I remember thinking to myself, this is curious that it's dated when it is, because there's certain things you just come across and you're like, how does this work post 70, or how does this work in 95? And I didn't necessarily know everything about church history at that point, but I just thought, this is really weird. This strikes me as something that is written a bit earlier. And then I got this was as a Christmas present, maybe in 2011, something like that, which tells you how much of a loser I am. This would be my Christmas present. I got Thomas Heron's book on the dating of first Clement, and it's something that argues primarily from the internal evidence. It only has a tiny bit of material on the external evidence at the end, but it presents a case for the early dating based on the internal evidence, and it was the kind of stuff that I was seeing as well. And so this was, I was nerdy enough that I asked for this for a Christmas present, and I saw this guy is seeing all these things that I was seeing too, and things I hadn't seen, all kinds of stuff. And evidently, if I have the story correctly, I believe that Benedict XVI was actually persuaded by Heron's book that no, this was an earlier, that Clement was to be dated earlier. And so the way that I used to summarize the evidence was that the internal evidence supported the earlier dating and the external evidence supported the later dating. And that's when I say external evidence, I was thinking primarily Eusebius, because we just kind of follow Eusebius. We put that there. I now think that I'm incorrect. I had, if this was a, if we were being really nerdy here, I would share my screen with you and show you this very, very nerdy Excel sheet that I have. It's actually a number sheet that goes in, has all of the pieces of external evidence that I've been able to find on the dating of First Clement that we have from the early church, which is then sort of ranked. And so it's like those that would seem to support an early dating is over here, those seem to support the late dating are over here, and then it's kind of weighted, so something kind of be towards the middle or just slightly over. And having done that, I have found that the only clear witness that we have, which is saying from the early church, yes, this is when this is dated, is actually Eusebius. Eusebius seems to kind of be out on a limb here. And actually, if you look at the way that the data, you analyze the data and to see like what does it seem to fit with better, actually most of the external data that I've been able to come across seems to more easily support the earlier dating in 6970 than it does the later dating. If we look at internally, there's a few things that you can look at. So I'll take two of them. One of them is the temple, and so this is one of your big questions in if you're looking at early Christian studies, is to what degree can the presence or non-presence of the temple, i.e., referring to the temple as still standing or referring to the temple as destroyed, be used as something to date early Christian writings? In general, kind of more skeptical biblical scholars are going to say, "Oh no, you can't go and do that, whatever, because whatever, you can't do that." I'm not so certain about that. Having spent a fair bit of time in the early Christian writings, it is something that you notice. So, Epistle of Barnabas, for example, which everybody dates after 70 AD, so usually sometime between like either 70 or 80, or around like 135. Epistle of Barnabas refers to the destruction of the temple and talks about that, and it refers to it apologetically. It's just, in a sense that it's written against non-Christian Jews, and it says, look, your temple is destroyed, all that stuff is gone. Similarly, Justin Martyr, the dialogue with Trypho, which purports to be taking place around 135 AD, he and Trypho discuss this. Hey, the temple is destroyed, it's gone now. And so, how is it that you guys want us to go and obey the Mosaic law when it's not even possible? Because if there's no temple in which we could even do these kinds of things, how could we celebrate all these festivals when you guys aren't even allowed to go there anymore? And so you do see this showing up, not everywhere, but in general, in early Christianity and in these kinds of sources that postdate the temple, it does often, show that it's has been destroyed and is appealed to apologetically. It's really interesting if you look at Clement, because Clement does not do that. In fact, what Clement does is quite the opposite. Clement, at a really key part in his argument, which, what he's doing is he's writing from the church in Rome to the Corinthian church, saying that the presbyters that they got rid of, that the apostles had appointed to be their successors there, that they should be reinstated, because neither he nor anybody else has the authority to go against what the apostles have instituted. So the apostles said these guys as the successors, we shouldn't go against what was done by apostolic precedent. They should be the ones who are in charge. And he makes a number of appeals throughout the document as to why that should be the case. And then just before he kind of really gets to saying, here is what happened, here is what you should do, his big example is he appeals to the temple and says, look at the temple, look at the way that, if you look at the sacrifices that are being offered in the temple, not everybody goes and offers the sacrifices, but it's just the certain people that are ordained through the priesthood to go and do this. And it's not offered at any time, but just at the times that God has appointed. And so too, looking at the temple as our example, we can recognize that within the new covenant that God has inaugurated, that there's ways that the apostles said these things should go and happen, and so we should follow the ways that they appointed for their things to happen. It is a really odd argument to make if the temple is sitting in ruins, in rubble, in Jerusalem, because the various obvious rejoinder to Clement would be, yeah, there was something that was ordained and that was destroyed and done away with, just like the temple was. Now, it's possible that Clement is just a little dull. He's just not a smart guy. He doesn't, he just uses bad analogies, and that's what's going on. But if you spend, I think, even a little bit of time with Clement, you'll recognize this is a brilliant piece of writing. As part of why I've spent so many years with it, is the way that, though he, I think, understands himself to have a kind of authority in the situation, and the way that he thinks that he is called to go and act on that authority, the reason that First Clement is so long is because he is giving the rationale so clearly from as many angles as he possibly can before he goes and presents any kind of argument from authority, saying this is why you should do this, therefore go and do this. It really saves that kind of imperative that, to the very end, and you have so much evidence by the time that you get there, you're like, okay, this really seems like what he's saying is very, very reasonable. It's the first time I read it, I just thought, gosh, this reminds me of like a really, really long Philemon, where Paul isn't commanding Philemon to do what he wants to do, but he's giving really clear reasons why it is that Philemon should do the thing that he suggests he's going to do, and then kind of at the end, you get the message by the end. It's like a really, really long Philemon, in the way that it's recommending this course of action, and then finally saying at the end, really, I mean, you should do this. And so it's hard to go and to say, oh, Clement just had no idea what he's doing when he was feeling to this. It's hard to see how it's intelligible as an analogy in a period where the temple isn't there anymore. One more, there's lots of these, if you're looking at internal evidence, but one more I think is interesting. You have, in the very beginning, you have what's usually translated as like the sudden and repeated misfortunes and events that have taken place here, among us. And you think, okay, well, what's he talking about there? The traditional answer is, oh, well, there was a persecution under Domitian, and so because there's a persecution under Domitian, that's the sudden repeated misfortunes and events, and that's why it is that Clement has taken a long time, writing back and to try to address the issue, what's happening in Corinth. But pretty much everybody has agreed these days that there is very little evidence for a persecution under Domitian. So Bart Ehrman, for example, in his edition of stuff says, we've got like no evidence for this. More conservative commentators will go and say, we've got like basically no evidence for this. Tertullian, interestingly, goes in his apology, if I have the details correctly, I think that he goes, and he's writing to the emperor, he says, if you look at the emperors in general haven't gone crazy against this. They haven't been going nuts trying to kill us all. And the only people who have done that have been like the bad ones. And so you have Nero, who everybody recognizes, bad dude. Well, guess what? He especially hated us. And so bad people hate us, wouldn't you know? And then he has a comment where he says that Domitian at one time tried to do something like this and then went and pulled back. Well, it's interesting because if that was something that happened, but it was something that happened one time and they pulled back from it, it's hard to see how that meets the criteria for being sudden and repeated misfortunes and events. How does that work if there is nothing that's repeated there? Where this would make sense historically, if you're just thinking, if you're into Roman history, think of what's happening in 69 and 70 AD in Rome. You have the year of 4 emperors. You have, if you're thinking within the Roman Empire, you have a period of instability, which I think is without precedent in Roman history up to that point, where you've got 1 year, literally 4 emperors all back to back to back. And it's not just, this isn't the kind of thing where, Galba, he got sick with the bad flu and then he died and then the vice president took over. Roman, when power changes hands in Rome, it's usually not a peaceful undertaking. It's usually because you have warring factions that are all going and killing each other, and this sort of leaves everybody and everything in this state of paralysis. And that's what happens in the year of 4 emperors. That's what that's what you get from 6970 AD. And so if you're thinking of sudden and repeated events and misfortunes that have taken place among us, that is to say in Rome, that would fit the bill. And you can see how it is that Clement wouldn't need to give any more detail to anybody in Corinth as far as the, hey guys, I'm talking about the year of 4 emperors. Have you heard about the year of 4 emperors? Because everybody in the Roman world would know what's going on there. So that's another piece of evidence, if you're looking at the internal data, that would seem to accord more easily with your 6970 AD than the later one in the mid-90s. And then you have the external data, which again, originally looking at this question, I thought that it supported the late date, and having really looked at it, it seems as though Eusebius is kind of an outlier actually, relative to what people are saying, about how this all worked, and that is tied in with the question of the succession from Peter to Clement, just because you get so many sources reporting this this direct conferral of authority from Peter to Clement.
All right, that's awesome. I originally thought that so when I was thinking about the sudden and repeated calamities, I was thinking about, I like your suggestion a lot, but I was thinking about, could it be maybe the martyrdom of Peter and Paul as well? Could those be the sudden and then repeated, right? Because then you had, it's either Peter or Paul died first. Probably what I've heard is that it's Paul and then Peter, but, I don't know if you have a take on the martyrdom sequence of that, but, what do you think about that possibility?
Yeah, I don't think that that's an impossible referent. And I think that in my view, that would perhaps work better than a persecution under Domitian, just because if there is a persecution under Domitian, the one thing that we would seem to know about it was that it was not repeated. So in my view, what would make what you suggested be less likely than the year of 4 emperors option is just, it seems as though the Neronian persecution, when you're reading through Clement, seems to not be a reality that Clement is himself living under. It just doesn't seem as though that's what's going on. Is it possible that kind of post Nero, everything is looking up, and you can still refer to this as somehow like you're still living the shadow of those events, and you have to take those into account as like things that are delaying any kind of response? I think that's possible, but it seems, if you're looking at the context in which Clement is written, it doesn't seem as though I'll say it positively, it seems as though the dust has settled a little bit. And so that's why, in my view, I would say having at least a couple of years there of space would be most intelligible.
All right, let me see. So I think we've already discussed like why Clement was written, right? It was to kind of talk to the church in Corinth about them deposing their leadership. But let me just ask you kind of some topical questions about First Clement itself, right? So the first one I have here is, what does Clement contribute to the justification debate? Because he does talk about justification and so on and so forth. So what does he got to say?
Yeah, so Clement has so much good, valuable stuff here. The first thing that I should say is, if you think of my book and looking at works of the law and in the early church, the way that was interpreted, one of the things that is interesting with Clement is there seems to be no conflict with Judaism whatsoever within this letter. You can't find really anything like that. And if anything, it's the opposite. Clement refers to the church as Israel in such an just unconscious way. It seems as though what Paul talks about in Romans 11 with the Gentiles being grafted onto Israel is just sort of first principles for Clement. And so he just takes texts that are talking about Israel and applies them to the church without argumentation or anything like that. And so if one is trying to get at, hey, what are the works of the law? It can be hard to figure this out from Clement, which is why, though I mentioned Clement a number of times in my book, you don't have a Clement chapter just because there's no conflict with the Jews that's present here. What you do have with Clement is, I would say, you have two principles that are really clearly articulated that are fundamental if you're looking at what does the early church mean by salvation? How do they understand it to work? One of them is that salvation is completely unmerited. There's nothing that one does on an individual level to merit the grace that God gives us, which transforms us, which makes us into, a new creation. That grace of justification is something that nobody does anything to get. And you could have got this, I would say, already from, the Bible elsewhere. In that, if you're thinking of, Titus 3, for example, is another really clear place where you see this. If you're looking in, 1 Timothy, if you're looking in Ephesians 2, it's a principle that's there, and you really don't need to go farther than, Romans 5. If you think of, the way that God shows his love for us is this: that while we were still sinners, Christ died, for us, not when we were righteous, not when we had done all sorts of, righteous works and holiness of heart, to use the language that Clement uses in chapter 32. That is first principles, and you have to I think, get that to understand, early Christian soteriology and not misunderstand it. Actually, it's interesting. I think just as helpful, if not even more helpful, here is Second Clement. If you look at, say, the first 5 or so chapters of Second Clement, because you have that stated up front so clearly that there's no way that humanity, by its own powers and efforts, could have saved itself. So you have that first principle. The second principle, which you then see in the subsequent chapters of Second Clement, which you see all over the place in First Clement, and which is, I think, for most readers is even more striking, is that one who has received God's grace is accountable for what they do with that grace. Both in Second Clement, so from kind of two onwards, that's really, really strong as a theme, and that's really everywhere in First Clement as well. The fact that Christians who have received God's grace, who have received this transformative power, that they will be judged, in a sense, not just as everybody else, but they'll be judged more strictly than anybody else. And it just follows your to him much is given, much will be required principle. And so the response should be a really godly kind of fear, knowing that we have received the thing that God has promised throughout all of the scriptures. We have received the new heart. If we think of Ezekiel, for example, God, and what he does by his justifying work, he takes out your heart of stone and gives you a heart of flesh. And so if you have received this transformation, if you've received this power, you will be held more accountable for it. And there is a sense, there is a greater accountability that you have to God for what he has given you than, say, one of the pre-Christian patriarchs would have had. You see that everywhere in Clement. It's all over the place. And it's really interesting. So the first thing I ever wrote on Clement was a paper that was looking at the soteriology in First Clement 30 to 35, because you have both of these principles side by side, right next to each other. And it's one of those things where commentators, I think, who, largely Protestant commentators of various backgrounds, have had a really hard time holding together the soteriology of First Clement. And I think that actually, in a sort of post New Perspective on Paul, then also just in general, like a post John Barclay world, and recognizing that you can have, to use John's phrase, which I love, that you can have the way that he says it. God's grace is unconditioned, but not unconditional. that it's unconditioned and that there's nothing that one can do to, merit it. You receive it precisely as a sinner, but it's not unconditional in that there are real conditions and responsibilities and obligations that come along with it for which we are really accountable. It's like, if you get that, then you get First Clement, you get the rest of early Christianity, you get the rest of the Paul, you get the rest of the Bible, you get it. It all goes in the whole, holds together and makes sense if you get, what he's saying there. And so I think, in a sense, I think that commentaries that are, written from, by those who are within biblical studies on First Clement from this point onwards, I think are going to be a bit less dismissive and polemical and quizzical and confused when it comes to interpreting what Clement is saying here, because even somebody, I think it's like it might have been Lightfoot who says that Clement shows anxiety basically in trying to reconcile Paul and James. And while we as commentators might, particularly those who have Protestant backgrounds, might feel anxiety in trying to reconcile Paul and James, I wouldn't say that Clement finds any. You don't really see anxiety here. He's not sitting on the anxious bench or anything like that. You just don't have any evidence of anxiety. He seems very comfortable in reconciling those perspectives. And I think that the way that biblical scholars in general are, I think right now, able to hold together those various sides of, Paul's theology and other things within early Christianity. So too here, if you're looking at early fathers such as Clement, that kind of paradigm works perfectly. The third thing I'll say is that this is something that Tom Wright argues for, that there is an incorporative element to justification, that justification makes you part of God's people. That's part of what justification is and does. And I think that for some folks, and myself included, I'm not always certain how much substantiation that has within biblical texts themselves. But it's really interesting if you look at First Clement 32, because First Clement 32, following from 31, does seem as though it's talking about the way in which those who are part of the Corinthian church and those who are Christians in general have become God's people, and that's going tracing the lineage back to Abraham, and then Isaac, Jacob, the 12 scepters, the 12 tribes, that go in descent from him. And then it goes and talks about justification. And we too, are justified not by, the works that, we've done in holiness or anything, but, by the faith through which God has justified, all those from the beginning. If you stop and think about it, in context, it does seem as though there is an incorporative element there, i.e., being made part of the covenant, being incorporated as far into God's people. Is that the primary sense there or the only sense? I don't know if I would necessarily say that, but I would say that that is an area where the things that Wright is pointing towards, and the things that Paul is doing, and there being an incorporative aspect of justification that does seem to cohere with the data that you find in First Clement as well.
And I noticed that you mentioned Second Clement in your response, and so I wanted to, probe you or just explore this issue a little bit, because I know that most people are okay saying Clement wrote First Clement, but the authorship of Second Clement is kind of more up in the air. What is your take on the authorship of the Second Clementine epistle?
Yeah, oh man, this is getting fun stuff for me. So I will say that I am unpersuaded by both sides of the argument.
That's awesome.
I'm unpersuaded by both sides. And so if somebody wants to say, I don't think that this is by Clement, and here's the reasons why, I'm okay with that view. And I think that there are reasons that I think you can point to. I would then go and say, hey, I have questions for you. Can you explain this? Can you explain this? Can you explain this over here? Because there's these really interesting correspondences between First and Second Clement that I think require some kind of explanation. There is clearly a relationship between these documents. So the question is, where do these correspondences come from? Why are these kinds of things here? On the other side, if somebody says, hey, I think Second Clement, I know everybody says it's not by Clement or whatever, but I think it actually is. I would say, great, that's cool. Like, I can see the reasons, for that. I've looked really close to these documents. Again, there are correspondence, but how do you explain this over here? So how do you explain, for example, here, it's interesting. It's actually the external attestation, which, the early church fathers themselves, Eusebius himself goes and tells you there's a second one by Clement, but we don't know if it actually is by him or not. It is, you clearly find the early fathers agnostic, or at least uncertain on the question of whether Second Clement actually comes from Clement or not. And so that would be my question for somebody who wants to say positively, is how do you account for the external evidence, which even in the early period seems to be uncertain about this? Why would that be? And so from my standpoint, I don't have anything dogmatic to say besides that. I try to encourage people to not be dogmatic about the question itself, because again, if you're thinking, Eusebius, Jerome, other early figures like this, they clearly have a real measure of reserve when it comes to the authenticity of Second Clement. And so I don't think that one is, being impious by having a measure of reserve, towards it as well. From their standpoint, and I think their historical vantage point is important, there's good historical reasons for having reserve when it comes to Second Clement. I think that if Second Clement is from the same context that First Clement is, if you were to basically follow that hypothesis and say, okay, if this were Clementine, and what nature would it be from Clement? Like, what would actually be happening here? The scenario that would make most sense in my head would be that the Second Clement is clearly a homily. It's clearly, it's putting in a homiletic form something that is not in homiletic form in First Clement, because First Clement's so long, it just goes on for forever. And it's great, but it is, Eusebius describes it as long and wonderful, which it is. It's long and it's wonderful. It might even be Irenaeus who goes and says that, because Eusebius goes and quotes Irenaeus in Book 3 of Against Heresies here as well. I think that it might originally come from Irenaeus. Second Clement is clearly a homily, and if I were to give a hypothetical reconstruction for where Second Clement came from, if it was actually from Clement, my suggestion would be that Second Clement does, and in a kind of homiletic form, what First Clement does in epistolary form. First Clement is clearly written to the leaders of the church, and I think it quite clearly doesn't just have the leaders in Corinth in view. You don't go and write something that's 65 chapters or something like that to just answer one simple question that you could have answered in one chapter. I think it's clearly written for a wider audience, knowing that the issue that's come up in Corinth is going to be an issue elsewhere too. And so it is giving a really comprehensive engagement with the particular issue that's there. Second Clement is a lot briefer, and it's clearly written to both men and women. You have a broader audience. I think you can say Second Clement is taking a lot of the themes that you find in First Clement, and it is giving them to, I think, what is a wider audience in a homiletic form, an audience that isn't just the leadership of the church, not just those who are the decision makers. And in doing so, it quotes from a lot of the same texts as First Clement, including certain texts. And this is, for me, the strongest evidence for there being a real positive connection, even that these are given at the same time. There's certain texts that it goes and quotes from that we don't know what it is. It says, as the scripture says, and it gives you this passage, and we don't know what it's talking about. So it talks about a tree, look at the tree and this branch. It goes, first you see this thing and this thing over here, and then it does this, then finally you go and you get this thing. You think, that's really cool. Where's that come from? We have no idea. We don't know where it comes from. But First and Second Clement both use this passage as to demonstrate a certain kind of point, and they share it in common, and I think it's unique. I don't think it's represented anywhere else. So that, plus a lot of other correspondences, would if First Clement were delivered for, the leadership of the Corinthian church, and then the leadership that you see, in the Christian churches more broadly, Second Clement would be, hey, locally at the church level for everybody, that everybody's hearing, what is the message that Clement has for the church? That to me would make sense. It would make sense of why, if you're looking at the manuscript tradition, you always have First and Second Clement together. It's one of the things that's really interesting. We don't have any copies of First Clement that don't have Second Clement after it. They're always travel together within the manuscript tradition. And so that would, it would explain that as well. If they actually were, in a sense, delivered together, one does a certain duty, the other does, another kind of duty in a more abridged form. That would make sense historically. Do I think that that's absolutely the case? I don't know. I think that is, if one takes that view and one thinks that the evidence leans more strongly for there being, like these actually were both from Clement, a scenario like that would make the most sense to me and would explain a lot of the data. But having said all of that, I still, I'm still agnostic on the question as to whether or not that actually is the case. Whatever position you take, Second Clement is still great. It's still really enjoyable, and there's a lot of valuable things to it. Like I said, it's putting at a lower level a lot of what First Clement is doing at a bit of a higher level. And my students in our patristic class this term, they read it and just loved it as a homily. It is a really great, powerful homily, and it's the earliest preserved Christian homily that we have as far as a full size anything. And so, as a historical artifact, I think it's actually, even though it's sort of the younger brother that's kind of in the shadows, I think it's in a sense just as significant as First Clement is as well.
That's wonderful. So my next question is, what exactly does Clement say about apostolic succession?
Yeah. So again, this is one of the things that, from my standpoint, coming to these texts from somebody who didn't have a background, within churches that had much to do with the apostolic succession. I don't think I knew what the apostolic succession was before I really started reading Clement. This is all sort of a kind of a foreign world to me. What's interesting is when you get to First Clement, this is I have this here. So this is chapters 42, 43, 44. Clement finally is making the clear appeal to why it is that the Corinthians should reinstate the presbyters that were deposed, and whether you want to translate presbyters as presbyters or priests or elders or anything like that, or episcopoi, so bishops, because again you see that word used to describe them clearly as well. And it says here, in the beginning of 44, apostles likewise knew through our Lord Jesus Christ that there be strife over the bishop's office. For this reason, therefore, having received complete foreknowledge, they appointed the leaders mentioned earlier, and afterwards they gave the offices a permanent character. That is, if they should die, other approved men should succeed to their ministry. These, therefore, who were appointed by them, or later on by other reputable men, with the consent of the whole church, who have ministered to the flock of Christ, blamelessly, humbly, peaceably, and unselfishly, and for a long time been well spoken of by all, these we consider to be unjustly removed from their ministry. So you see, this is the central argument that you have of Clement. It's taken 44 chapters to get up to it, but this is what he's saying. A couple of things that I think are interesting here. One is, and this is again, as somebody as coming as initially as an outsider, one of the things that was striking to me is that it did not seem to be a point of contention whether or not the apostles had done this, whether or not they had appointed the first fruits from their churches and had given them the authority that the authority that they themselves had to succeed in their ministry, and that this is something that would continue on. That first step did not seem to be a point that was contested by those who had broken away in Corinth. That seemed to actually be a point of agreement between all the parties. So the Roman Church and then both sides in Corinth. It was something that here Clement could appeal to. The thing that was, contested was not the fact of the apostolic succession. It was the character of the apostolic succession, which is to say, does what the apostles themselves did, does that practice have a permanent character? Do we need to follow what it is that the apostles instituted when it came to ecclesial organization? Or do we not need to follow that? And that, it seems, in Corinth was somewhat of an open question, because clearly you have some people who have broken away, who have deposed this, and that's what the whole thing is written to address, the schism that's happened in the Roman church, the Corinthian church, where you have those who are following those that the apostles appointed and think, no, we can't go and break away from these. The apostles did this. They gave us this as the way to hand on authority in the church, and so we can't go and make up something else. And then you clearly have others who have a differing view that what the apostles instituted was not necessarily meant to be the thing for all times. That's going to be binding for every year, every generation, but there could be other ways of structuring ecclesial authority. It could be other ways of figuring out who should be the leader in the church besides those who were to be in this succession. That, it seems, is the real point of contention that we have in Corinth. Not the fact of the apostolic succession, but the character of the apostolic succession, and whether that is meant to have a kind of permanence. And that's part of why, when Clement is answering this question, he takes so long to do it. And if you look in the section just before this, what he's doing is he looks at the priesthood that you have in the Old Testament. And this is part of when you see Israel as being like, hey, we are Israel, we're incorporated. There's a new covenant. We are now incorporated into Israel as well. So everything from Israel's scriptures, it all applies to us. It all speaks to us right now. And so if you say, look, in the Mosaic covenant, when that was, this is God given, this is all written for our benefit. We know that there's no lies in scripture or anything like that. Clement clearly has a really high view of, the authority of the scriptures. When he looks at Moses and he says, look, Moses knew there was going to be fighting over the priesthood. He knew it. And so this is why you see him going and doing the thing with getting the rods. They all get the rods together, and every tribe put a rod in, and we're going to see what's going to happen. We're let God choose this, and whatever he chooses is going to have a permanent character, which is to say, whichever tribe is chosen for this, they are going to be the ones that are going to do this from here on out, from generation to generation. And this is going to keep everybody from fighting over this all the time, because God has selected it. He has ordained it. So then you have the rod of Aaron goes and blossoms, and there's almonds and everything like that. It's really cool. He says, Moses knew it was going to happen. God told him it was going to happen, but the people needed to know. And so this is the way that God made it, so that you wouldn't have this constant warfare, and how within the nation, everybody knows it's the Levites. It's those who are Aaron's descendants who are supposed to serve in this particular capacity. And then he just turns to the apostles and said, look, the apostles did the exact same thing. They knew, like Moses, what was going to happen. They knew what was going to take place. They knew how this, this position of leadership in these churches was, people were going to fight over it. You're going to have dissension. And so they did what Moses did here. They clearly went and showed the way that succession was to take place. And if we break away from that, we're putting ourselves in a like position to those who would go and break away from what God had clearly ordained, under Moses, and with the staffs, etc. So that's the way that the argument works, and that's really the culmination of everything that's been said up to this to this point in First Clement. Again, the thing that for me, as a newcomer to all this, that was striking was that there did not seem to be a denial, at least from what you can tell in kind of mirror reading, that this had taken place, that the apostles had done this. And if there was, if this wasn't common ground, it'd be easy to rebut this. If this is like, if Clement's just making something up, then the answer on the other line is nope, and then you hang up, because this didn't happen. You're just making things up. This argument only has, carries any kind of weight if this is something that he can appeal to as common ground. And then the way that you answer the question isn't like, oh, did the apostles do this or not do this? It's like, if we look in scripture elsewhere, is there things that God ordains? Is it meant to have a permanent character? If we look to Moses, if we look to Aaron, if we look to Levites, is it meant to have a permanent character? The answer is yes. So then, so as it was then, so too in the new covenant, the apostles meant for this to have a permanent character as well.
All right. And we're getting to, I think, our next to last question. So this next to last question concerns the relationship between bishops and presbyters in Clement's letter, right? And so, once again, kind of going back to some old ground on a controversial subject. And, from what I can tell, I think this was a commentary that I read, but I can't recall off the top of my head. Yeah, usually bishops and presbyters, they're kind of like neatly not overlapped usually, but then there is a part in Clement when he does kind of use them interchangeably. And there's this question then on what was the structure of the church according to Clement. What was he really saying? Is it a 3-tiered office, or is it a 2-tiered office? Are bishop and presbyter interchangeable? What's your take on this particular question? Maybe in Clement, but also just in general.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is that this isn't the area that I'm strongest, just because it's not the area that I'm most interested in. Everybody comes with their own interest in the text and the things that this person jumps out to them. And I think that there's something that's beautiful in that, because somebody will have other questions in mind. They'll go to the text and they'll, be able to really get stuff out of it that's profitable for everybody. And for me, I tend to be more interested in soteriology, and I tend to be more interested in how this relates to the kinds of things that we find in the New Testament. And I mean, you find ecclesiology in the New Testament as well. You find your division, etc. So there, that all is relevant. It's just, for me, has never been like the really animating area. And so the first thing I want to say is somebody could probably listen to you on this and get profit more from it than they could from listening to me do it. I will say in general terms, you do have both a distinction and an overlap. In that when you're talking about presbyters can be used to describe those who are the episcopoi, your bishops. And so they're clearly not totally exclusive categories. The episkopos does not necessarily seem to be a presbyteros. In this sense that not every person who is an overseer or a bishop, or however you want to translate an episkopos, it does not seem as though every one of those, not every presbyteros can be described as an episkopos. And so I don't know if crocodiles and alligators is helpful here. I always get it wrong which one is which, as far as like one is like a subset, of the other. I can't remember how they work. I'm in California, in the Bay Area. We don't have any crocodiles or alligators here besides like at the zoo. And even then I can't tell the difference. So it's really hard for me to figure out. If somebody was in South Florida, they could answer this question for you. My sister Lauren has been spending a lot of time in South Florida lately, so I'll ask her and see if she can tell me how my analogies are supposed to work. But I can't. I haven't spent time in South Florida, so I couldn't answer the question. I think that you do have clearly the episcopoi, the bishops, who are the ones in question, and those are the ones who have been deposed. And the question is, what do we, is there authority to go and to get rid of them? They can be described as either episcopoi or presbyteroi. And I don't think that that's a problem really, or a huge apologetic thing, either in that context, or if you fast forward 2,000 years in, our context, because you can have somebody who isn't a bishop who is also a priest as well. And, you can refer to them, I don't know, if one is engaging with somebody who is a bishop, they are both father, whoever, and they're, bishop, whoever, and both of those things apply. You also have you also have who's the real bishop. And the real bishop is Jesus Christ. He is the one who is described as the episkopos as well. And so that little bit that you have, I think it's in 1 Peter 2, if I remember correctly, you have it in 1 Clement 59, I believe, where it's Christ who is also described as, the episcopon, the bishop of our souls, which is itself beautiful. I think really, really cool as well. And something where it's like, you can see the way that, somebody who is part of the episcopacy, they're sharing, and they have a subdivision. They're a delegate of Christ's own episcopacy, which I think is a cool idea.
All right. And my last question for you, Dr. Thomas, is how did the early Christians view First Clement? Did they think it was inspired? How much authority did they place on it? Could you go into all those details?
Yeah, First Clement is probably the closest candidate that you have for a writing that does not become part of the candidate or part of the canon of the New Testament, but which might have. Clement is clearly read in the early church. You find the language of First Clement reflected all over the place in the 2nd century. So it's clearly a really influential piece of writing. You're going to find correspondences, for example, in places like the Epistle to Diognetus. It seems like you have some there. In Irenaeus, you absolutely have influence. And it's interesting because Irenaeus, he cites Clement the same way that he does the other scriptures. And so there seems for Clement, or for Irenaeus, that he takes it as an authoritative document. Now, he also does the chapter of Hermas. And so it's not as though it's the only one that's like that. But by the time that you're getting, to the end of the 2nd century in Irenaeus, Irenaeus doesn't just sort of cite everything kind of, willy-nilly. He has it seems as though you have in Irenaeus a real canonical sense and a real canonical content as well, even if that's not 100% defined, either in his day or even in Eusebius's day, over a century later. Around the margins, it still seems for quite a while this is there's questions as far as which writings do you take to be those that form your measuring stick. So the measure, if you think what a canon is, it's a measuring stick. It's your ruler by which you go and measure everything else. So granted that Clement is great and helpful and fantastic and important, is it one of those writings that you use as part of the canon, in the sense that you use it as part of the measuring stick? That question takes quite a while to answer, and I don't think that every minister has the same answer to that question for a long time. And so if you're looking in the early centuries of the church, one of the things that is a piece of kind of canonical criteria is use in the churches. And so Eusebius will talk about this, where it's like, we know that First Peter is authentic because it's been used in the churches from so long or whatever. And this other one we're not sure about because it's not used in as many churches. If you look at First Clement, he's very clear. First Clement has been used in the churches for a very, very long time. And if I remember correctly, there is a writing that we have from Bishop Dionysius in Corinth to Pope Soter around 160 AD, if I remember correctly, from Eusebius, where Dionysius is talking, he's just saying, hey, thank you for the aid that you've given us, thank you for helping us, and thank you for writing to us as well. We read your, we're reading your letter, here on Sunday, the way that we have been, reading Clement, and so it's interesting. It's like they seem to be using Clement in, as part of, the early liturgy when they're, have the meetings. The Clement is what they read on Sunday, or at least one of the things they read on Sunday. And that seems as though that's reflected in Irenaeus as well, because, Irenaeus, the way that he cites it, it's in a way that is, it's of a like kind as the rest of the, the authoritative apostolic writings. As we go forward into history, you will find that Clement is included in some of the actual New Testament, manuscripts, some of the codices. And so at DSPT here in Berkeley, the Dominicans on the West Coast here that I teach with, we had a little Bible study called the Codex Alexandrinus Bible Study, which was reading the Greek of First Clement together, because First Clement is in Codex Alexandrinus, and so it's it's there, and so it's part of at least that Bible, and so we read it. Now, do we necessarily read it in the exact same way as the New Testament writings? Not necessarily, but still, you recognize it is part of that Bible. It's there. You will find this in a lot of other early manuscripts. The Apostolic Constitutions, I believe, have First and Second Clement among the Catholic epistles. And then I can't remember if it's the Apostolic Constitutions or if it's a Syriac manuscript, actually has them even before, has the Catholic epistles before the Pauline epistles. So you're actually reading Clement before you even get to Paul. I think that's either in, I think it's only in one source, if I remember correctly. So it is, both First and Second Clement, but most prominently First Clement, are really highly valued by the early church and do make it within some manuscripts that we have of the New Testament itself. So we think of why is it that it's not in most of them? What goes and puts it so that we don't have it in our New Testament today. There's a few things that you can say here. I think that the most basic thing is that First Clement is clearly written from a post-apostolic context. And so if you're thinking of the material that makes it into the New Testament, as far as what is going to give us the definitive rule for how we measure everything else, in later doctrine writing, etc. The documents that become part of the New Testament canon are all either by somebody who is themselves an apostolic, writer of some sort, depending on how you're going to define apostle, but somebody who is part of that first generation, or somebody who was writing along with them and was part of this as it was all going on. So if you think of Mark is supposed to be recording what it was that Peter is saying as he's preaching, and so there's which it is kind of Peter's gospel. If you look at Luke, interestingly, similarly, you have the connection with Paul, and Luke is identified as, in some ways, Paul's gospel, because Luke is along with Paul, kind of doing all these sorts of things at the same. He's clearly along for the ride if you read the book of Acts. And so this is when, from the early church's standpoint, they see that Luke was written, and so they sort of placed it within that first apostolic generation. First Clement is clearly written after that. It's clearly the way that it refers to the apostles in the past tense is, I think, really distinct from what you find in the New Testament writings. It's clearly the next generation afterwards. Even if you do take the early dating, you place it quite early, it's still referring to Peter and Paul and their martyrdoms in the past tense, and as these examples to be followed. And if you were to ask me to sort of fall into conjecture as far as why is it that we don't have this within our New Testament manuscripts, I think it's because that is that sort of unique charism of that first generation is that's the quality of the documents that make it into the New Testament canon. And things like First Clement, though they're always around, they're always referred to, it's always valued, and honestly is is sometimes read even more than other writings in the New Testament. You get more references, in the early church, if you're looking really in the first, few centuries, just as a point of comparison, if you think of like, James is an epistle that we don't have a whole lot of external attestation to within the first couple centuries. Finally, Clement of Alexandria, then Origen. But even then, it's, Eusebius is not 100% certain where James comes from. He can't go and verify it in the way that he can with Clement. Clement, everybody knows about. Everybody's had Clement sitting around for forever. And so even if it doesn't make it into the final canon, I don't think that for most people, or really anybody that I can think of, that I can't think of anybody who would say that is a judgment on the quality or the value of what one has in First Clement. And I think that both in the early church and then onwards, I think it's served as this really perennially valuable I would say witness to the first generation of post-apostolic Christianity. And then if you're looking at Second Clement, the earliest recorded full, if we think of like what does a Christian sermon look like, Second Clement gives you that, the first recorded instance of that, and it's powerful. It is really good. For us, it would probably strike us as a little intense, but I think that's good for us. At least that's good for me. I don't know if it's good for you or anybody else, but I think that it's good for me to really be challenged by the kinds of things that you find there. So.
Well, Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for coming on to my show again and to talk about Clement of Rome and First Clement. Dr. Thomas, let me see here. I've seen that you've done some stuff with reason and theology. Are you going to be appearing on any other podcasts, or do you have a blog, or, are you doing anything like that?
Soon, I just got kids.
Yeah.
I just got a bunch of kids. We got 4 kids here.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I got a bunch of kids. So I don't have a blog. I don't have any of that stuff. So if you want more, feel free to apply to DSBT in Berkeley. It's a incredible, fantastic place, and I love being able to serve there. But I don't have a blog. I don't have anything. I get messages from you on Messenger saying, "Hey, you want to come do a show?" I'm like, "I absolutely want to do a show. It sounds like great fun." And so, I use Facebook sometimes, but during Lent I don't use it then. And so, but if somebody needs to get a hold of me, either via email or through that, usually get me.
Well, thank you so much once again.
Awesome. Thank you, Suan.